The taste of reclaimed air still haunts me from when the last xenos world fell silent. They don't want you to know about what comes after victory. The real horror isn't the enemies we destroyed across 10,000 years of war. It's what we became in their absence. This is my testimony. I was Chronicler-Prime Matthias Valen, assigned to the 847th Expeditionary Fleet for the final push into the Eastern Fringe. 47 of us witnessed the moment when the last heretic stronghold crumbled to ash. Now, I'm the only one left to tell you what the Final Crusade's end really means. You think victory would bring peace, hope, the golden dawn of humanity's destiny fulfilled. But when the last bolt round was fired and the final enemy fell, something else died with them. Purpose. Direction. The very thing that held our species together for millennia. What happens when a war machine designed for eternal conflict suddenly has nothing left to fight? When Space Marines bred for battle face an empty galaxy? When the Imperium of Man finally achieves what it set out to do 10,000 years ago? I've seen the answer. Emperor preserve us all. Chapter 1. The silence falls. The silence was what I noticed first. Not the absence of screaming or the cessation of bolter fire, but something deeper. The quiet that settles over a galaxy when its heartbeat finally stops. I stood on the observation deck of the Eternal Vigilance, watching the last fires die on Xerion Prime, and felt the weight of an ending I had never been trained to recognize. 10,000 years. That's how long the Great Crusade had raged across the stars, morphing from the Emperor's grand design into something far more desperate, far more necessary. The Horus heresy had carved the dream in half, leaving us with fragments of hope and an ocean of rage. What followed wasn't the glory we'd been promised, but survival wrapped in the rhetoric of righteousness. I had chronicled 847 campaigns across 3 centuries of service. My autoquills had recorded the deaths of billions, the purging of entire sectors, the systematic elimination of everything that dared to call itself humanity's enemy. Orcs, Eldar, Tau, Necrons, the endless spawning horrors of chaos. All of them had fallen to our fury, our faith, our absolute refusal to accept anything less than total dominion. Captain General Thaddeus Corvin stood beside me, his Terminator plate still smoking from the final assault. The man was a walking monument to war. Augmetic left arm, bionic right eye, neural interface ports gleaming beneath his grey hair. He'd been fighting since before I was born, and his silence carried the weight of someone who had just witnessed the end of everything he understood. "Chronicler," he said, his voice carrying the metallic edge of vocal cord damage from 1,000 battlefields. "What do we do now?" The question hung between us like a prayer waiting for an answer from a god who had stopped listening. Below us, Xerion Prime burned its last defiant fires. The planet had been the final stronghold of the fallen angels, Chaos Space Marines, who had eluded Imperial justice for 7,000 years. Their fortress monastery had withstood siege for 18 months, its dark stone walls inscribed with blasphemies that made seasoned battle brothers weep blood. But stone crumbles. Flesh fails. Even the promises of dark gods prove hollow when faced with Imperial determination. The 3rd Company Ultramarines had broken their gates. The Sisters of Battle had purged their temples. The Astra Militarum had counted their dead in millions and called it acceptable losses. Victory had come, as it always did, through superior firepower and an absolute refusal to acknowledge defeat. Now Xerion Prime was just another dead world in a galaxy full of them. The difference was that this death meant something more than tactical advantage or resource denial. This death meant completion. "Sir," I replied, consulting the data slate that had been my constant companion for 3 centuries. "According to Sector Command, all identified xenos threats have been eliminated. All heretical enclaves have been purged. The Tyrannid hive fleets were destroyed at the Battle of Ultima Threshold. The last Orc War died with Warboss Scarjaw at Mordian. Even the scattered remnants of Abaddon's Black Legion were hunted down in the Maelstrom." Corvin's bionic eye whirred, as it focused on something beyond the viewport. I know the tactical reports, Chronicler. I'm asking what they don't tell us. What they don't tell us. That was the question that kept me awake during the ship's artificial night cycles, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, while the eternal vigilance drifted through empty space. The Imperium had been at war for so long that peace had become a theoretical concept, something discussed by scholars and theologians, but never experienced by the men and women who actually fought. Our entire civilization was built around the assumption of eternal conflict. The Space Marine chapters existed to wage war. The Imperial Guard was raised to die in battle. The Adeptus Mechanicus forged weapons and armor for campaigns that stretched across centuries. The Ecclesiarchy preached a gospel of righteous fury, teaching billions that their purpose was to hate and kill in the Emperor's name. What happens to a war machine when there's nothing left to fight? Sir, I said carefully, I believe we may need to redefine our operational parameters. Corvin's laugh was bitter as acid rain. Operational parameters. Listen to yourself, Chronicler. We just ended a war that began before Terra learned to count years properly, and you're talking about operational parameters. He was right, of course. The language of the Imperium was the language of war. We had words for siege, assault, purge, cleanse, but our Gothic dialect struggled with concepts like reconstruction, growth, or simple peace. Even our prayers were battle hymns, our ceremonies reenactments of ancient victories. The Voxcaster crackled to life, Admiral Neris Valdez's voice cutting through our contemplation. All senior staff to the Strategium. Priority Alpha. Corvin and I exchanged glances. Priority Alpha had meant enemy contact for as long as either of us could remember. But there were no enemies left to contact. The Strategium hummed with nervous energy as we entered. The massive hololithic display that usually showed enemy positions and tactical overlays now displayed nothing. Empty space. Dead worlds. Silent sectors that had once screamed with war. Admiral Valdez stood before the display, her uniform immaculate despite 3 days of orbital bombardment coordination. She was old-school Imperial Navy, the kind of officer who could navigate both political currents and stellar ones with equal skill. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Gentlemen, ladies," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding fleets. "I've just received word from Terra. The High Lords of Terra have officially declared the Great Crusade complete." The word hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Complete. Not victorious, not triumphant, but complete. Finished. Done. Tech Adept Axiom, 7 Gamma's mechadendrites, twitched in what I had learned to recognize as confusion. Query. Definition of complete in current context requires clarification. "It means," Valdez said slowly, "that there are no more enemies to fight. The Imperium of Mankind now controls the galaxy. All identified threats have been eliminated. All heretical enclaves have been purged. The Emperor's vision has been achieved." Captain Commander Lycia of the Adepta Sororitas spoke first, her power armor still bearing scorch marks from the final assault. "What are our new orders?" That's what we're here to determine," Valdez admitted. "High Command is reviewing our operational status." The silence that followed was deeper than the void between stars. We were the finest military force in human history, trained to wage war across impossible distances against enemies that defied comprehension. We had gene-forged warriors who knew nothing but combat, battleships designed for century-long campaigns, and an industrial base that could manufacture weapons faster than worlds could be born. And suddenly, we had no one to use them against. "There must be something," Corvin insisted. "Unexplored sectors, hidden xenos enclaves, chaos cults that escape detection, Tech Adept, 7 Gamma's optical sensors focused on the tactical display. Negative, Captain General. Long-range auger arrays detect no xenoform signatures. Chaos energy readings have fallen to baseline levels following the destruction of the Maelstrom facilities. Probability of undiscovered hostile forces, 0.003%. Then what do we do? The question came from Lieutenant Cassius of the Ultramarines' 3rd Company, and hearing it from a Space Marine, a warrior literally bred for war, made it somehow more terrible. I found myself thinking about my homeworld, Scintilla Prime, and what it might look like without the constant threat of invasion hanging over it. The tithe worlds that had spent millennia shipping food and soldiers to feed the war machine could actually feed themselves. The Forge worlds could turn their mighty foundries towards something other than weapons of war. But what? What does humanity build when it's no longer fighting for survival? We maintain readiness, Admiral Valdez said finally, but her words lacked conviction. We patrol our sectors. We ensure the Emperor's peace is maintained. Peace. Another word that felt foreign on an Imperial tongue. The meeting dissolved into smaller discussions, officers clustering around data terminals and trying to make sense of reports that suddenly seemed meaningless. Casualty projections for campaigns that would never happen. Resource allocation for enemies that no longer existed. Battle plans for wars that had already been won. I returned to my quarters and sat before my chronicler's desk, staring at the blank parchment scroll that awaited my daily report. For 3 centuries, I had filled these scrolls with accounts of glorious victories and necessary sacrifices, the deeds of heroes and the deaths of martyrs, the slow but inevitable expansion of Imperial control across the galaxy. Now I had nothing to write except the truth. That victory, when it finally came, felt like defeat. Outside my viewport, Xerion Prime continued to burn, its fires the funeral pyre for more than just a heretical stronghold. They were burning the dreams of warriors who knew nothing but war, the hopes of a species that had forgotten how to live in peace. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth again, and I began to write. Chapter 2. The First Cracks. 3 weeks after the silence fell, the first reports of anomalous behavior began filtering through Imperial channels. The language was carefully neutral, the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that the administratum used when no one wanted to admit they didn't understand what was happening. I received the first data packet while the Eternal Vigilance was en route to Macraga for what Admiral Valdez had euphemistically called strategic consultation. The truth was that nobody knew what to do with a battle fleet that had no battles to fight, and High Command was hoping that Marneus Calgar might have some wisdom to offer. The report came from Cardia, or rather, from New Cardia, the fortress world that had been established after the original fell to the 13th Black Crusade. Commissar Vextrix of the 47th Shock Troops had filed what he called an incident report regarding his regiment's behavior following their final engagement. Subject: 47th Cadian Shock Troops. Disciplinary concerns. Classification: Vermilion date 3.847 M42. Following successful elimination of cultist cell on Mordax 7s, elements of 47th Shock Troops have exhibited concerning behavioral patterns. Symptoms include prolonged periods of inactivity, failure to respond to non-combat orders, spontaneous weeping during evening prayers, and recurring requests for purpose clarification. Note: similar reports received from 23rd Talon, 15th Vostroyan Firstborn, and 8th Mordia, requesting guidance on appropriate response. I read the report 3 times before its implications settled into my mind like poison. These weren't inexperienced PDF troopers or freshly tithed guard units. These were veterans, soldiers who had fought across multiple campaigns and sectors. They were the backbone of the Imperial war machine, and they were breaking down. The second report came from Titan, where the Grey Knights were experiencing what Castellan Drygo carefully described as spiritual disorientation. Space Marines who had spent centuries battling the forces of chaos were finding themselves unable to enter proper meditation cycles. Their battle brothers spoke of dreams filled with silence, of waking in cold sweats, because the psychic screaming that had been the background noise of their existence for so long had simply stopped. The third report was perhaps the most disturbing. It came from a forge world in the Segmentum Solar, where tech adepts had begun dismantling weapons production lines without authorization. When questioned, they claimed they were following logical efficiency protocols. Why manufacture ammunition when there was nothing left to shoot? Their Magos had been forced to invoke emergency preservation protocols to prevent the complete shutdown of their military-industrial complex. Captain General Corvin found me in the Eternal Vigilance's archives, poring over casualty reports from the Xerion Prime campaign. The numbers were standard for that type of assault. 47,000 guard casualties, 12 Space Marine losses, 156 Sisters of Battle killed in action. Acceptable losses for the complete elimination of a Chaos stronghold. But something about those numbers felt different now. Before, they had been part of a larger calculation, a cost paid toward ultimate victory. Now they were simply waste, lives spent to achieve a goal that had already rendered itself meaningless. "Chronicler," Corvin said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movement of a man whose bones had been broken too many times to count. "Tell me what you're seeing in these reports." I gestured to the data slates scattered across my workspace. "Breakdown, sir. Complete systemic breakdown of Imperial military efficiency. Elaborate." I pulled up the tactical display, highlighting sectors across the galaxy in various shades of amber and red. The Ultramarines chapter is reporting a 34% decrease in training efficiency. Their neophytes are struggling to find motivation for combat drills when they know they'll never face real battle. The Imperial Fists are having similar problems with recruitment. What do you tell potential initiates when the fortress you've spent 10,000 years building no longer has enemies to keep out? Corvin's bionic eye whirred as it focused on the display. "What about the Guard?" "Worse," I admitted. "Morale is collapsing across multiple regiments. The Vostroyan Firstborn are requesting reassignment to PDF duties. The Death Corps of Krieg are, well, they're asking what they're supposed to die for now." The Death Corps question had particularly disturbed me. These were soldiers who had been bred and conditioned to seek glorious death in the Emperor's service. Their entire culture was built around sacrifice and martyrdom. Without a war to die in, they were experiencing what their medical officers could only describe as existential crisis. "There's something else," I continued, calling up a classified report from the Adeptus Mechanicus. "The tech priests are beginning to question the logic of maintaining our current force structure. Why keep 1,000 Space Marine chapters when there's nothing for them to fight? Why maintain Titan legions when there are no enemy war machines to face? They're starting to apply efficiency calculations to our entire military apparatus." Corvin was quiet for several minutes, his gaze fixed on the scrolling data. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had just realized the scope of a problem beyond his ability to solve. "The Imperium has been at war for 10,000 years, Chronicler. Our entire civilization is built around that conflict. Our government, our religion, our technology, our culture. Everything exists to support the war effort. Remove the war, and what's left?" I finished. He nodded slowly. "What's left?" The question haunted me as I continued to analyze the incoming reports. The patterns were becoming clearer with each data packet, and they painted a picture of an empire beginning to devour itself. On Ophelia 7, the Adepta Sororitas were struggling with the theological implications of a war-free galaxy. Their entire faith was built around the concept of righteous fury, of purging the Emperor's enemies with blade and flame. Without enemies to purge, some sisters were beginning to question whether they had truly been serving the Emperor's will, or simply feeding their own desire for violence. The Space Wolves were having their own problems on Fenris. Their recruiting trials had always been based on selecting warriors capable of endless battle. Young Fenrisians who had dreamed of joining the rout were finding it difficult to embrace a future that offered no glorious combat, no saga-worthy deeds to be sung around the fires of the Great Hall. Even the Adeptus Custodes, those golden guardians of the Emperor himself, were reportedly struggling with their new reality. They had been created to protect the Master of Mankind from threats that no longer existed. What purpose did the 10,000 serve in a galaxy where the Emperor's enemies had all been slain? But perhaps the most troubling reports came from the civilian populations. For 10 millennia, Imperial citizens had lived with the constant knowledge that hostile forces sought their destruction. The Imperium's harsh governance, its endless tithes and brutal enforcement had all been justified by the existential threat facing humanity. With that threat gone, people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Why did they need to surrender 90% of their agricultural output when there were no armies to feed? Why did their children need to be tithed to fight wars that would never come? Why should they accept the brutal oppression of the Adeptus Arbites when there were no traitors left to suppress? Governor Vex of Talon had filed a request for governance restructuring, essentially asking permission to reduce imperial oversight of his world. The request had been automatically denied, but the fact that a planetary governor had even dared to make it represented a shift in thinking that would have been unthinkable during the war. The Voxcaster chimed, indicating an incoming priority transmission. Admiral Valdez's voice filled the archive chamber, tight with controlled tension. All senior staff to the Strategium. We've received new orders from Terra. Corvin and I exchanged glances. Orders. Perhaps High Command had finally figured out what to do with us. The Strategium was more crowded than usual when we arrived. In addition to the regular senior staff, representatives from each of the ship's major contingents had been called to attend. Space Marines stood beside Sororitas warriors. Tech adepts interfaced with guard officers, all of them waiting for someone to explain their purpose in this strange new galaxy. Admiral Valdez stood before the hololithic display, which now showed the Segmentum Solar in detail. Terra glowed at its heart, like a golden beacon, surrounded by the countless worlds that formed the administrative center of human space. "I've just received our new operational directive from the High Lords of Terra," she announced. "The Imperium is implementing what they're calling the Consolidation Protocol. We are to return to Terra for reassignment." The word carried implications that none of us wanted to examine too closely. Reassignment could mean anything from new sectors to patrol to complete decommissioning of our force structure. "What about the other fleets?" Captain Commander Lysia asked. "Similar orders. Every Expeditionary Fleet is being recalled to Terra. Every Space Marine chapter is being ordered to report their current status and receive new operational parameters. The Guard regiments are being evaluated for continued service necessity." The silence that followed was filled with the subtle hum of the ship's systems, the background noise of a war machine that no longer had a war to fight. Through the viewport, stars wheeled past in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the crisis of purpose consuming their would-be conquerors. I found myself thinking about the millions of soldiers throughout the galaxy who were experiencing this same crisis. Veterans of the Long War who had known nothing but conflict since their first day of training. Space Marines who had been created for eternal battle. Sisters who had devoted their lives to holy war. What do you do with warriors when the war is over? The answer was beginning to take shape in the reports filtering through Imperial channels, and it was uglier than any xenos invasion. You watch them break apart. Chapter 3. The Weight of Victory. The journey to Terra took 6 weeks, traveling through the most secure shipping lanes in Imperial space. 6 weeks of empty hyperspace, jumps between dead sectors, past memorial worlds where great battles had once raged, through systems that had been cleansed of all life except the human settlements that now served no strategic purpose. During those weeks, the reports continued to arrive, each one painting a darker picture of the Imperium's response to its own success. The Space Wolves had begun something they called the Final Hunt, a desperate search across their recruiting worlds for any enemy that might have escaped detection. When they found none, some packs had begun hunting each other, claiming that only through combat could they honor their Primarch's legacy. 3 Bloodclaws had died in what the Wolf Priests euphemistically called training accidents, before Logan Grimnar had been forced to impose martial restrictions on his own warriors. The Iron Hands were systematically dismantling their recruitment processes, arguing that creating new Space Marines was inefficient resource allocation in a pacified galaxy. Clan Captain Dravark had reportedly sealed himself in the Vault of Certainty, refusing to emerge until someone could provide him with a logical justification for the chapter's continued existence. But it was the report from Ball that truly crystallized the scope of our crisis. Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels and regent of Imperium Nihilus, had sent a personal vox message to the High Lords of Terror. The ancient warrior, who had served for over a millennium, had asked a simple question: what is the purpose of angels in a world without devils? His blood angels were struggling with the absence of enemies worthy of their fury. The black rage that had sustained them through countless battles was becoming self-destructive without external targets. Battle brothers were falling into something the sanguinary priests called victory melancholia, a deep depression brought on by the realization that their greatest purpose had been fulfilled and there was nothing left to achieve. 3 companies of Blood Angels had requested permission to enter stasis until such time as new enemies emerged. When that permission was denied, they had begun voluntarily entering the dreadnought sarcophagi, preferring the dreamless sleep of the machine to the waking nightmare of a peaceful galaxy. I was reviewing these reports in my quarters when Captain General Corvin found me. He looked older than I had ever seen him, his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled from restless sleep, his augmetic arm hanging loose at his side as if he had forgotten to activate its servos. "Chronicler," he said, settling into the chair beside my desk, "I need to tell you something. Something that's not going into the official reports." I set aside the data slate I had been reading and gave him my full attention. In 3 centuries of service, Corvin had never spoken to me of anything off the record. Yesterday, during the night watch, I found Lieutenant Cassius on the observation deck. He was staring out at the void, and when I asked him what he was thinking about, he said something that's been eating at me ever since. Corvin paused, his bionic eye flickering as if accessing a memory file. He said, "Sir, I was made to kill the Emperor's enemies. They gave me 2 hearts so I could fight longer, 3 lungs so I could endure more, enhanced muscles so I could strike harder. I was created to be the perfect weapon. But what is a weapon without something to destroy?" The question hung in the air between us like a funeral shroud. Lieutenant Cassius was a space marine, a warrior who had undergone the most extensive physical and psychological conditioning known to mankind. He had been transformed from a normal human into something barely recognizable as such, all in service to a single purpose: to wage war in the Emperor's name. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Nothing," Corvin admitted. What could I tell him? That he should find a new purpose, that he should adapt to civilian life. The Ultramarines don't have civilian lives, Chronicler. None of them do. They exist to fight, and now there's nothing left to fight. He stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the starfield that surrounded us. "Do you know what's happening on the recruitment worlds? The places where we used to find new initiates for the Space Marine chapters?" I shook my head. "They're dying. Not from war or disease or natural disaster, but from emptiness. Young men who would have given anything for the chance to join the Adeptus Astartes are choosing other paths. Why would they undergo the agony of transformation when there's no glory waiting for them? Why suffer through the trials when there are no enemies to test their strength against?" The implications settled into my mind like ice water. The Space Marine chapters had always maintained their strength through recruitment from death worlds and feral populations, places where only the strongest survived to adolescence. But those worlds had produced warriors because war was the highest aspiration their cultures could imagine. Without war, they would produce what? Farmers, craftsmen, simple civilians living simple lives. "The Adeptus Mechanicus is already running efficiency calculations," I said, consulting my notes. "They estimate that maintaining our current force structure costs approximately 47% of the Imperium's total production capacity. Ship construction, ammunition manufacture, power armor maintenance, training facilities, all of it requires massive resource allocation that could be redirected toward other purposes." "Other purposes?" Corvin repeated. "Like what?" It was a fair question. The Imperium had been organized around war for so long that we had no institutional memory of what a peaceful human government might look like. Our entire economic system was built around supporting military operations. Our technology was focused on killing and defense. Even our art and culture celebrated martial virtues and glorious death in battle. Infrastructure, I said, reading from the Tech Adept reports. Civilian manufacturing, scientific research not related to weapons development, exploration of non-strategic sectors, agricultural enhancement, medical advancement, education systems not focused on military training. Each word felt foreign in my mouth, concepts so removed from imperial tradition that they might as well have been xenos languages. There's something else, Corvin said quietly. Something I haven't reported to Admiral Valdez. He activated his personal data slate and showed me a message he had received from an old comrade, General Thane of the Cadian 7th Shock Troops. The text was brief but deeply disturbing. Corvin, need to speak with someone who will understand. Lost 3 officers yesterday, not to enemy action, to suicide. They couldn't adapt to the idea of a galaxy without war. What do you tell a soldier who has never known anything but combat that his fighting days are over? How do you explain to someone who has spent their entire life preparing to die gloriously that they're going to have to learn to live instead? Thane, the message included classified statistics that made my blood run cold. Suicide rates among Imperial Guard veterans had increased by 340% in the months following the Final Crusade's end. Post-combat stress disorders that had been manageable during active campaigns were becoming crippling psychological conditions. Field medics who had saved countless lives on battlefields were finding themselves powerless to heal minds broken by peace. There are rumors, Corvin continued, that some regiments are creating their own conflicts, border disputes with other guard units, training exercises that turn deadly. Anything to maintain the illusion that they're still soldiers rather than relics of a war that no longer needs fighting. The Voxcaster interrupted our conversation with Admiral Valdez's voice. All hands, prepare for translation into the Sol system. Terror approaches. Through the viewport, the golden light of humanity's birth star began to resolve into something more than a distant point of illumination. We were coming home, but to a home that had changed as fundamentally as we had, even if none of us understood how yet. I thought about the millions of warriors throughout the galaxy who were struggling with the same questions that plagued Lieutenant Cassius. Space Marines who had been created for eternal war. Guard regiments who knew nothing but combat. Sisters of battle whose faith was built around righteous fury. The Imperium had spent 10,000 years creating the most effective military force in galactic history. We had forged warriors capable of facing any enemy. Weapons that could crack planets, strategies that had conquered an entire galaxy. But we had never prepared for victory. As terror grew larger in the viewport, its golden glow reflecting off the adamantite hull of the Eternal Vigilance, I began to understand the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just a military crisis or a political challenge. This was an existential threat to the very nature of human civilization in the 42nd millennium. The Imperium had won the war for the galaxy's future. Now we had to learn how to survive the peace. The ship's cogitators chimed with incoming messages from the Terran system. New orders, new protocols, new directives for a new age. But as I read through the carefully worded commands and euphemistic reorganization plans, I realized that the High Lords of Terror were as lost as the rest of us. They could order fleets to stand down and regiments to disband, but they couldn't order warriors to forget how to fight. They could restructure the military hierarchy and redirect resource allocation, but they couldn't restructure 10,000 years of human culture that had been built around the assumption of eternal war. Outside the viewport, terror continued to grow, its surface covered by the golden spires and soaring cathedrals that had been built to celebrate humanity's destiny as conquerors of the stars. Soon we would walk among those monuments to victory, trying to figure out what victory actually meant. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth again, and I realized that the air we had reclaimed wasn't just that of conquered worlds. It was the air of our own lungs, taken from us by a war that had consumed everything we were and left us struggling to remember what we had been before the fighting started. We had won everything, and in doing so, we had lost ourselves. Chapter 4: The Golden Throne's Shadow. The approach to Terra was unlike anything I had experienced in 3 centuries of Imperial service. Supply convoys and diplomatic vessels that formed the arteries of an empire at war. The orbital space around Terra had always been a controlled chaos of military necessity. Now, the approaches to Terra felt empty. Oh, there were still ships. Naval patrols moved in lazy patterns, their crews going through motions that had lost all meaning. Even the mighty orbital defense platform seemed somehow diminished. Admiral Valdez's voice echoed through the ship's Vox systems as the Eternal Vigilance took its assigned position in high orbit. All senior staff, report to the embarkation deck for immediate transit to Terra. Priority Alpha clearance has been granted for direct approach to the Imperial Palace. Direct approach to the Imperial Palace. In the old days, such clearance would have meant the direst of emergencies, threats so severe that normal protocol had to be abandoned for immediate action. Now it simply meant that the High Lords of Terra were as confused as the rest of us and wanted answers quickly. From this altitude, the planet looked peaceful, almost idyllic, replaced by golden spires and soaring buttresses that caught the light of Sol and cast it back as a promise of human greatness. But even from orbit, I could see the signs of our new reality beginning to manifest. Training facilities that had processed recruits for 10,000 years were dark, their massive construction cradles holding half-finished vessels that would never face combat. His expression grim as he reviewed the briefing materials we had been provided and military reorganization frameworks. The language was bureaucratic, almost apologetic. "Listen to this," he said, reading from one of the data slates. Recommendation 7. Implementation of graduated demobilization programs for excess military personnel. Translation: they want to figure out how to get rid of most of us without causing mass civil unrest. The ecclesiarchy was struggling just as much as the military. How do you maintain a faith built around righteous fury when there's nothing left to be furious about? Corvin's bionic eye whirred as it focused on something beyond the Thunderhawk's viewport. Honestly, half of them would accept discharge orders gladly. They're tired, Chronicler. 10, 20, 30 years of constant combat, and now they finally have a chance to go home. Problem is, most of them don't remember what home looks like anymore. The Death Corps especially. Military service isn't just their job, it's their entire identity. Take away their war, and you take away everything that makes them who they are. The Thunderhawk shuddered as it entered Terra's outer atmosphere, and I caught my first clear view of the Imperial Palace in over 2 centuries. The massive structure dominated the landscape like a golden mountain, its countless spires and battlements rising toward the sky in a testament to human ambition. Somewhere within those walls, the Emperor of Mankind sat upon the golden throne, his immortal consciousness somehow still guiding the species he had sought to unite beneath his banner. Had he foreseen this? In all his infinite wisdom and supernatural foresight, had the Emperor anticipated the crisis that would come with victory? Did he know that his loyal servants would struggle to find purpose in a galaxy finally cleansed of his enemies? The thought was borderline heretical, but I couldn't shake the feeling that even the Master of Mankind might be surprised by our success. Our pilot's voice crackled through the Vox. Approaching Palace Landing Bay 77. Be advised, we have priority clearance straight to the throne room antechamber. The throne room antechamber. My mind reeled at the implications. In 10,000 years, I had never known anyone below the rank of Lord Commander to be granted audience so close to the Emperor's presence. Whatever the High Lords wanted to discuss with us, it was serious enough to warrant the highest possible security clearance. The landing was smooth, professional, the kind of textbook approach that Imperial pilots could execute in their sleep. But as we disembarked onto the palace deck, I noticed something that made my chronicler's instincts prickle with unease. The custodian guard escort that met us was different. They still wore their magnificent golden armor, still carried their guardian spears with absolute authority, still radiated the supernatural presence that marked them as the Emperor's chosen protectors. But there was something in their bearing that spoke of uncertainty a subtle shift in posture that suggested even these perfect warriors were struggling with their new reality. Captain General Trajan Valoris himself led our escort, and that fact alone told me more about the severity of our situation than any briefing document could have. The leader of the Adeptus Custodes did not personally escort mere fleet commanders unless the matter at hand threatened the very foundations of imperial governance. Captain General Corvin, Valoris said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Chronicler-Valen, welcome to Terra. The High Lords are waiting. We walked through corridors that had witnessed 10 millennia of human history, past tapestries that depicted the great victories of the Crusade and the terrible struggles of the heresy. But as we progressed deeper into the palace, I began to notice that the artwork was changing. The newest tapestries, those that should have celebrated our final victory, instead seemed uncertain, confused, as if the artisans who created them didn't know how to depict triumph without also showing the enemies who had been defeated. What do you put in a victory tapestry when the victory leaves you without purpose? The High Lord's council chamber was exactly as imposing as I had imagined. A vast circular room dominated by the symbols of imperial authority, with each High Lord seated behind a desk that represented one of the fundamental pillars of human civilization: the Master of the Administratum, the Fabricator General of Mars, the Grand Master of Assassins, the Captain General of the Custodian Guard. All the men and women who had guided humanity through its darkest hours now faced a problem they had never been trained to solve. Lord Commander Guilliman himself presided over the assembly, and I was struck by how different the Primarch looked from the heroic portraits that adorned every imperial shrine. There was weariness in his superhuman features, a weight of responsibility that seemed to have grown heavier rather than lighter with victory. When he spoke, his voice carried the same authority it always had. But underneath, I heard something I had never expected to hear from one of the Emperor's sons. Doubt. "Gentlemen," Guilliman began, his gaze encompassing our small party, "you represent a problem that we have been struggling to address for several months now. Your fleet, your forces, your entire operational structure exists to wage war against enemies that no longer exist. The question we must answer is this: what do we do with you now?" The bluntness of the question was startling. Usually, imperial conferences involved hours of ceremonial protocol and carefully coded language. This was different, the desperate directness of leaders who no longer had time for political niceties. "My lord," Captain General Corvin replied, "our forces remain ready for deployment to any sector where imperial authority needs to be maintained. If there are rebellions, pirate activities, or unexplored regions—" "There aren't," interrupted the Master of the Administratum, Lord Hazak. "That's precisely the problem, Captain General. Our records show that 94% of the galaxy's inhabitable systems are now under direct imperial control. The remaining 6% are either dead worlds or systems so remote that they pose no strategic value. There are no rebellions because there's nothing left to rebel against. There are no pirates because our naval patrols have been too efficient. There are no unexplored regions because our survey fleets have mapped everything." The silence that followed was profound. I found myself thinking about the millions of soldiers throughout the Imperium who were waiting for new orders, new campaigns, new purposes. What were we supposed to tell them? The Fabricator General of Mars, his mechanical voice distorted by vox grills, added his own perspective. "Current military expenditure consumes 73% of imperial productive capacity. Maintaining this force structure without active combat operations represents a fundamental inefficiency that threatens long-term civilization stability." "You're talking about decommissioning the Imperial Guard," I said, unable to keep the shock out of my voice. "We're talking about survival," Lord Hazak replied. "The Imperium cannot sustain a war economy when there is no war. Our agricultural worlds cannot continue to divert 90% of their production to feed armies that will never fight. Our forge worlds cannot continue manufacturing weapons and ammunition for battles that will never come. Our populations cannot continue to send their children to die in conflicts that have already ended." Lord Commander Guilliman leaned forward in his chair, his superhuman gaze fixed on us with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, Captain General, what is the purpose of the Imperial Guard in a galaxy at peace?" It was the same question that Lieutenant Cassius had asked, the same question that was being asked by soldiers throughout the Imperium, the same question that none of us seemed able to answer. To maintain the Emperor's peace, Corvin said slowly. To ensure that conquered territories remain loyal. To stand ready in case new threats emerge. "From where?" the Primarch asked. "We have eliminated every xenos species that posed a threat to humanity. We have purged every chaos cult, destroyed every heretical enclave, hunted down every traitor. The galaxy is ours, Captain General, completely and utterly ours. There are no new threats to emerge because we have been thorough beyond any historical precedent." The weight of his words settled over the chamber like a burial shroud. We had done our job too well. We had been so effective in our prosecution of the Great Crusade that we had eliminated not just our enemies, but our own reason for existing. "What are you asking of us, my lord?" I asked. Gilliman's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I saw not the superhuman Primarch, but simply a being who had been tasked with an impossible responsibility. "We're asking you to help us figure out what comes next," he said. "You've spent 3 centuries chronicling the Imperium at war, Valen. Now we need you to help us chronicle the Imperium at peace. We need to understand what our civilization looks like when it's not consumed by the necessity of survival. We need to discover who we are when we're not defined by who we fight." The Master of the Administratum activated a holographic display that showed resource allocation projections for the next century. The numbers were staggering. If current military expenditure continued without active conflict, Imperial civilization would face economic collapse within 50 years. Agricultural output could increase by 400%. Medical research could advance by centuries. We could build a civilization based on growth and exploration rather than conquest and defense. Through the chamber's massive windows, I could see the golden spires of terror stretching toward the sky, monuments to humanity's greatest achievements. But I realized that all of those achievements had been military ones. Chapter 5. The Weight of Peace. The quarters they assigned me in the Imperial Palace were larger and more luxurious than anything I had experienced in 3 centuries of military service. High-ceilinged rooms with actual windows that looked out over the palace gardens, furniture that had been crafted for comfort rather than functionality, artworks that celebrated human achievement rather than military glory. I hated every moment of it. For 36 hours after our audience with the High Lords, I found myself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to do anything except pace the ornate chambers and try to process what I had witnessed. The Imperium was preparing to fundamentally restructure itself, to transform from a civilization of warriors into something that had never existed in recorded human history, a galaxy-spanning empire at peace. The data slates they had provided contained detailed projections for what they were calling the Great Transition. Military forces would be reduced by 75% over the next decade. War production would be converted to civilian manufacturing. Entire Space Marine chapters would be disbanded or consolidated. The Imperial Guard would be restructured into a much smaller force focused on planetary defense rather than offensive operations. On paper, it made perfect sense. In practice, it meant telling millions of warriors that their lifelong service was no longer needed, that the skills they had spent decades perfecting were now obsolete, that the brotherhood they had forged in combat would be dissolved by bureaucratic decree. A soft chime indicated someone at my door. When I opened it, I found Captain General Corvin standing in the hallway, still wearing his dress uniform despite the late hour. His expression told me that he had been having the same struggles with sleep that I was experiencing. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "I need to talk to someone who understands what we're facing." I gestured him inside and activated the room's privacy screens, an old military habit that seemed inappropriate in a palace chamber, but felt necessary nonetheless. "I've been reviewing the transition protocols," he said, settling into one of the plush chairs that dominated my sitting area. "They're offering me a position as Director of Military Historical Research, Essentially, they want me to help write the official history of the Great Crusade's final campaigns. That doesn't sound too terrible, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Doesn't it? Corvin's bionic eye flickered in what I had learned to recognize as agitation. 47 years of active service, Chronicler. I've commanded fleets in 16 different sectors. I've overseen the liberation of 34 worlds. I've stood on the bridges of battleships as they brought the Emperor's justice to his enemies. And now they want me to sit in an archive and write reports about how we used to be important. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where tech adepts were already beginning to convert weapon storage areas into research laboratories. The transformation was happening quickly, efficiently, with the same precision that the Imperium applied to all its endeavors. But speed and efficiency couldn't address the human cost of such massive change. "What about you?" he asked. "What are they offering the chronicler who recorded our greatest triumphs?" I consulted the data slate containing my own reassignment options. Senior Archivist in the Department of Cultural Development. They want me to help document civilian achievements rather than military ones. Art, literature, scientific advancement, agricultural innovations, all the things that our civilization never had time to properly celebrate because we were too busy fighting. And how does that make you feel? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to examine. How did it make me feel? Relieved, terrified, hopeful, devastated, all of the above. Like everything I've dedicated my life to was meaningless, I admitted. Corvin nodded slowly. 3 centuries of recording the deeds of heroes, and suddenly heroism itself is obsolete. No more last stands, no more glorious charges, no more noble sacrifices for the greater good. Just efficiency reports and resource allocation studies. The Vox panel chimed with an incoming message. The sender identification made my blood run cold. Captain Commander Lysia of the Adepta Sororitas, currently attached to our fleet. The message was brief, but deeply disturbing. Priority alert. 3 sisters have requested voluntary martyrdom rather than accept discharge from service. Sister Superior Cordelia has barricaded herself in the ship's chapel, claiming that the Emperor would rather see her dead than demobilized, requesting immediate guidance on appropriate response. I shared the message with Corvin, who read it twice before setting the data slate aside with visible disgust. "How many more do you think?" he asked. "How many warriors are going to choose death rather than accept a peaceful retirement?" It was a question I'd been dreading, but couldn't avoid. Throughout the Imperium, soldiers who had known nothing but war were being told to find new purposes in a galaxy that no longer needed their particular skills. For some, that transition would be impossible. The Space Marines were perhaps the most tragic examples. They had been created for war, literally engineered to be perfect killing machines. Their enhanced physiology, their psychological conditioning, their cultural traditions, everything about them existed to support their function as warriors. Remove that function, and what remained? "I've been thinking about Lieutenant Cassius," I said, "about what he said on the observation deck. He was right, you know. The Space Marines were made to kill the Emperor's enemies. With no enemies left, what are they?" "Obsolete," Corvin said quietly. "Living weapons in a world that no longer needs weapons." Another message arrived, this one from Admiral Valdez. The Ultramarines' 3rd Company had formally requested permission to enter stasis until such time as new enemies emerged that would require their service. When informed that such enemies were unlikely to ever emerge, 17 Battle Brothers had requested termination of life support rather than face the prospect of existence without purpose. The reports kept coming throughout the night, each one adding another layer to the crisis we were facing. Death Corps regiments were experiencing mass psychological breakdowns. Iron Hands were systematically removing their own augmetics, claiming they no longer needed technological enhancement for non-existent battles. Space Wolves were abandoning their posts and returning to Fenris, where some packs had begun fighting each other just to maintain their warrior traditions. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus was struggling with the transition. Tech adepts, who had spent centuries perfecting weapons of war, were being ordered to redirect their research towards civilian applications. Many were finding it difficult to see the spiritual significance in agricultural equipment or medical devices when compared to the holy work of crafting instruments of the Emperor's justice. "There's something else," Corvin said, producing another data slate from his uniform pocket, "something that's not in any of the official reports." He activated the device, displaying a star map of the Segmentum Solar with several systems highlighted in red. "These are worlds where the transition isn't going smoothly," he explained. Cadius 7th, where 3 guard regiments have refused to stand down and are demanding new deployment orders. Ultramar, where civilian populations are rioting because they don't understand why the Space Marines who protected them for so long are being ordered to leave. Armageddon, where the local PDF has declared independence rather than accept Imperial oversight in a peacetime environment. The implications were staggering. The Imperium wasn't just facing a crisis of military reorganization. It was facing the potential collapse of the social order that had held human civilization together for 10 millennia. "They're calling it the readjustment crisis," Corvin continued. 300 worlds showing signs of civil unrest. 74 systems where local authorities have stopped responding to Terra's commands. 12 sectors where Space Marine chapters have gone completely silent rather than acknowledge their dissolution orders. I stared at the star map, trying to comprehend the scope of what we were seeing. The Imperium had survived the Horus Heresy, the Age of Apostasy, the Nova Terra Interregnum, and countless other crises. But all of those had been challenges that could be met with military force. How do you fight a war against peace itself? "What's the High Lord's response?" I asked. "That's the truly terrifying part," Corvin replied. "They don't have one. This isn't a problem that can be solved with battleships or Space Marine deployments. You can't conquer a crisis of purpose. You can't purge existential despair." A new message arrived, this one bearing the seal of Lord Commander Guilliman himself. The text was brief, but carried implications that made my hands shake as I read it. Emergency Protocol. 7-7 has been activated. All remaining expeditionary fleets are to return to Terra immediately. The Great Transition is being accelerated. We have 6 months to complete military reorganization before civil unrest reaches critical levels. The Emperor protects, but he also expects us to protect ourselves. Emergency Protocol 7-7. I had to access the classified archives to understand what that meant, and what I found there made me realize just how desperate our situation had become. Protocol 7-7 was the contingency plan for addressing threats to Imperial unity that could not be resolved through conventional military action. It had been created during the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, when the High Lords realized that some crises might require solutions that went beyond simple conquest or purification. Protocol 7-7 meant that the Imperium was facing an existential threat from its own success. 6 months, I said, looking up from the data slate. They think they have 6 months to figure out how to transition from a war economy to a peace economy, how to demobilize millions of soldiers, how to restructure 10,000 years of military culture, how to prevent the collapse of Imperial civilization. "Can it be done?" Corvin asked. I thought about Lieutenant Cassius staring into the void, about the Sisters of Battle who preferred death to discharge, about the Space Marines who were volunteering for stasis rather than face a peaceful galaxy. I thought about the millions of Guard veterans who had never known anything but combat, the Forge worlds that had never produced anything but weapons, the Death worlds that had bred warriors for 10 millennia. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think we're about to find out whether the Imperium is stronger than the war that created it." Outside the window, Terra's golden spires caught the light of the morning sun, casting long shadows across gardens that had once been parade grounds. The transformation was already beginning, but whether it would save us or destroy us remained to be seen. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth again, and I realized it wasn't the air of conquered worlds I was tasting. It was the air of our own uncertainty, thick with the fear that we might have won the galaxy only to lose ourselves in the victory. Chapter 6. The Unmaking. The next 3 months passed in a blur of bureaucratic urgency and barely controlled chaos. The Imperial Palace became the epicenter of the largest administrative undertaking in human history, the systematic dismantling of a war machine that had defined civilization for 10 millennia. I found myself assigned to Integration Committee 7, tasked with developing protocols for transitioning military personnel to civilian roles. It should have been straightforward work: identify transferable skills, provide retraining opportunities, establish support systems for veterans struggling with the change. In practice, it was an exercise in attempting the impossible. How do you teach a Space Marine to be a civilian when his bones are literally made of ceramite? How do you find civilian employment for someone whose primary skill set involves orbital bombardment? How do you provide psychological support for warriors whose entire identity is built around glorious death in battle? The committee met daily in a repurposed tactical center deep within the palace, surrounded by holographic displays that now showed resource allocation models instead of battle plans. Our membership was diverse: military officers like myself, administrator bureaucrats, tech adepts, even a few representatives from civilian worlds who were trying to understand what they would be receiving when the demobilization process was complete. Lord Administrator Kairis, a thin woman whose palace spoke of too many years spent in archive chambers, led most of our sessions. She approached the transition with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to managing vast bureaucratic undertakings. But I could see the strain in her eyes as the reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy. "Status report from Segmentum Solar," she announced during our morning briefing, consulting a data slate that seemed to grow thicker each day. Cadia 7's situation has escalated. The 23rd Shock Troops have declared themselves a sovereign military republic and are refusing to acknowledge Imperial authority. They're demanding the right to continue operating as an active military unit and have begun recruiting from local populations. The implications were staggering. We weren't just dealing with soldiers who didn't want to go home. We were facing the potential fragmentation of Imperial unity itself. Tech Adept Axiom. 9 Delta's mechadendrites writhed in what I had learned to recognize as agitation. Query: can civilian authority compel military compliance through non-violent means? That's what we're trying to figure out, Lord Administrator Kairis replied. Traditional responses to insubordination involve military force, but we can't use the Imperial Guard to suppress the Imperial Guard. That way lies civil war. Tech Adept 9 Delta's optical sensors focused on the holographic display showing the Cadia 7 system. Observation: current situation represents fundamental contradiction in Imperial governance structure. Military exists to serve civilian authority, but civilian authority requires military protection. Remove military threat. Civilian authority lacks enforcement mechanism. The Tech Adept had identified the core paradox of our situation. For 10,000 years, Imperial civilian government had existed because the military allowed it to exist. Space Marine chapters had chosen to serve the High Lords. The Imperial Guard had followed orders from Terra. The Imperial Navy had protected civilian shipping. All of that cooperation had been based on shared purpose: the prosecution of the Great Crusade. With that purpose gone, the delicate balance between military and civilian authority was beginning to collapse. "What about the Ultramarines?" I asked, dreading the answer. Kairis consulted another section of her data slate. Chapter Master Calgar has agreed to the consolidation protocol, but he's requesting a 50-year grace period to properly honor the service records of demobilized battle brothers. In practical terms, he's buying time and hoping we'll change our minds. And the other chapters. Mixed responses. The Imperial Fists are complying fully. They see the logic in efficient resource allocation. The Space Wolves have gone completely silent. The Blood Angels are, well, Dante has requested a personal audience with Lord Commander Gilliman to discuss alternatives to dissolution. I thought about my last conversation with Captain General Corvin, who had finally accepted his reassignment to the Military Historical Research Division. He had seemed almost relieved to have a new purpose, even if it was just documenting the end of the old one. But Corvin was unusual among military officers. He had always possessed an intellectual curiosity that extended beyond tactical considerations. Most soldiers weren't so adaptable. The committee's work was complicated by the fact that we were operating without historical precedent. Human civilization had never successfully transitioned from a state of total war to genuine peace. The closest analogies were the periodic truces that had occurred during the Crusade, but those had always been temporary, brief respites before the next campaign began. This was supposed to be permanent. "Status report from the Scholastica Psychana?" I asked. Lord Administrator Kyrus's expression grew even more grim. "The librarians are experiencing complications. Without active threats to focus their powers against, many are struggling to maintain proper psychic discipline. We've had 17 cases of accidental manifestation in the past week alone." Accidental manifestation. The euphemistic term for what happened when a psyker lost control of their abilities. In a combat situation, such incidents were contained by the immediate demands of survival and the presence of other psykers who could provide support. In peacetime, they became disasters waiting to happen. What kind of manifestation events? Minor reality distortions mostly. Time dilation, gravity fluctuations, temporary dimensional rifts. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the librarians report that their powers feel unfocused, without clear enemies to target. I made careful notes on my data slate, adding the psyker crisis to the growing list of problems that seemed to have no solutions. The Imperium had spent millennia developing systems to manage psychic humans in a military context, but we had no protocols for dealing with warrior mystics in peacetime. The morning briefing continued with reports from across the galaxy, each one painting a darker picture of the Imperium's struggle with its own success. Entire Forge worlds had shut down production lines, claiming they could see no logical purpose in manufacturing weapons when there was nothing left to fight. Agricultural worlds were refusing to maintain their massive output levels, asking why they should continue sending 90% of their crops to feed armies that were being disbanded. Most disturbing were the reports from recruitment worlds, the death worlds, and feral planets that had supplied the Imperium with its finest warriors for 10,000 years. Without the prospect of glorious military service to aspire to, these worlds were experiencing social collapse. Young men who would have competed for the honor of joining Space Marine chapters or elite guard regiments were instead turning to piracy, tribal warfare, or simple despair. We were witnessing the systematic breakdown of the cultural foundations that had sustained imperial civilization. "There is one piece of potentially positive news," Lord Administrator Kyrus said near the end of our session. "The first civilian infrastructure projects are beginning to show results. Agricultural yields on former military staging worlds have increased by 23% since the transition began. Medical research facilities are reporting breakthrough developments that were impossible when all resources were directed toward weapon development." "Any response from the affected populations?" I asked. "Mixed. Some worlds are embracing the opportunities that come with redirected resources. Others are less enthusiastic about trading military glory for agricultural efficiency." The understatement was profound. We weren't just changing economic priorities. We were attempting to transform the fundamental values that had defined human culture for 10 millennia. Glory, honor, martial valor, noble sacrifice. These concepts were deeply embedded in imperial society. Replacing them with productivity, efficiency, and peaceful prosperity was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. After the committee session ended, I found myself walking through sections of the Imperial Palace that I had never seen before. The transition had opened areas that had been closed to all but the highest security clearances, as the reduced military presence made comprehensive palace security less critical. I discovered chambers filled with artwork depicting the Great Crusade's greatest victories, galleries lined with weapons taken from defeated enemies, archives containing the personal effects of heroes who had died in the Emperor's service. All of it was being carefully catalogued and preserved, but the energy that had once surrounded these monuments to human achievement seemed diminished somehow. In a chamber near the throne room approaches, I found something that stopped me cold. A massive stained glass window depicting the final moments of Horus's defeat. The fallen Primarch lay broken at the Emperor's feet, while loyal Space Marines looked on in triumph. It was a magnificent work of art, technically perfect and emotionally powerful. But as I stared at it, I realized that it represented everything we were trying to move beyond. The window celebrated victory over an enemy, triumph through violence, the righteousness of destruction. What kind of art would we create now? What stories would we tell? What heroes would we celebrate? A soft footstep behind me indicated that I was no longer alone. I turned to find Lord Commander Guilliman himself approaching, his massive form somehow moving with perfect silence despite his ornate power armor. "Chronicler Valen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion I had never heard from a Primarch before. "What do you see when you look at that window?" "The end of an age, my lord," I replied honestly. "The last time we knew who we were and what we were supposed to do." Guilliman nodded slowly, his superhuman gaze fixed on the artistic depiction of his father's final victory. "I've been thinking about that a great deal lately. For 10,000 years, we defined ourselves in opposition to our enemies. We were the light because they were darkness. We were righteous because they were corrupt. We were human because they were xenos. And now? Now we have to define ourselves by what we are rather than what we oppose." He turned to face me, and I was struck by the profound weariness in his ancient eyes. "Do you know what that means, Chronicler? It means we have to discover who the human species actually is when it's not fighting for survival." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us was prepared to fully explore. Guilliman's expression grew even more somber. "Then we'll have won the galaxy and lost our souls in the process." A Vox alert chimed, indicating another urgent message from the Transition Command. As the Primarch read the contents, I watched his superhuman features harden into something that looked almost like despair. "What is it, my lord?" "The astropathic choir is reporting widespread communication disruptions," he said. "Without the constant psychic tension generated by galactic warfare, the Astronomican's signal is fluctuating. The psychers who maintain our interstellar communication network are losing focus." The implications were catastrophic. The Astronomican was the psychic lighthouse that made faster-than-light travel possible throughout the Imperium. If its signal began to fail, our galaxy-spanning civilization would fragment into isolated systems, cut off from each other by the terrifying darkness of the warp, holding it together. As Lord Commander Guilliman strode away to address this new crisis, I remained in the chamber, staring at the stained glass window that depicted a simpler time when our enemies were external and our purpose was clear. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth again, but now I understood what it really was. We weren't tasting victory. We were tasting the slow suffocation of a civilization that had forgotten how to breathe without war. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 5 months into the Great Transition, the first open rebellion began on Armageddon Prime. The world that had witnessed some of the most brutal conflicts in Imperial history, the Orc invasions, the Chaos incursions, the legendary battles that had forged heroes and claimed millions of lives, finally erupted in civil unrest when the local authorities attempted to implement civilian governance protocols. The irony was brutal. Armageddon had survived War, Gazkul, and the depredations of Angron himself, only to tear itself apart in a conflict over the meaning of peace. I received the initial reports while working in the palace archives, attempting to develop cultural transition protocols for worlds that had defined themselves through military service. The data came through in fragments, each transmission more disturbing than the last. Local PDF units had refused orders to stand down, claiming that Armageddon's strategic importance required continued military readiness. When the planetary governor attempted to redirect military resources towards civilian infrastructure projects, 3 regiments had declared independence from imperial authority. What began as administrative resistance had rapidly escalated into open warfare between traditionalist and progressive factions. The situation was complicated by the fact that Armageddon's civilian population had no real experience with non-military governance. For generations, their world had operated under martial law, with military commanders making decisions about resource allocation, population movement, and social organization. The sudden introduction of civilian bureaucrats seemed almost as alien to them as a xenos invasion. Captain General Corvin found me in the archives, his expression grim as he handed me a data slate containing the latest intelligence reports. "It's spreading," he said without preamble. 17 worlds in the Segmentum Solar alone are showing signs of similar unrest. The Transition Command is calling it resistance to administrative restructuring, but we both know what it really is. I scanned the reports, noting the pattern that was emerging across multiple sectors. Worlds with strong military traditions were rejecting civilian oversight. Planets that had served as staging areas for major campaigns were refusing to convert their infrastructure to civilian purposes. Systems that had produced elite military units were declaring independence rather than accept demobilization orders. "Civil war," I said quietly. "Civil war," Corvin confirmed. "The thing we spent 10,000 years preventing is about to tear the Imperium apart from within." The situation was complicated by the fact that many of the rebellious worlds had legitimate grievances. Their populations had sacrificed everything for the Great Crusade. Sons and daughters sent to die in distant battles, resources tithed to support military operations. Entire cultures reshaped around the demands of war. Now they were being told that those sacrifices were no longer necessary, that their way of life was obsolete, that they needed to reinvent themselves as civilian societies. Some worlds were adapting successfully. Agricultural planets were increasing food production for civilian consumption rather than military rations. Research facilities were redirecting their efforts toward medical advancement and scientific exploration. Former weapons manufacturing centers were retooling to produce civilian goods and infrastructure equipment. But for every success story, there were 3 failures. Worlds that couldn't imagine any purpose beyond military service. Populations that preferred the familiar tyranny of martial law to the uncertain freedom of civilian governance. Cultures that had forgotten how to exist without external enemies to fight. "What's Lord Commander Guilliman's response?" I asked. Corvin's expression grew even darker. "That's the problem. Traditional Imperial response to rebellion involves military force, but using loyal units to suppress rebellious ones would just prove their point. That civilian authority is meaningless without military backing. Send Space Marines to pacify Armageddon, and you validate their claim that only warriors can truly govern human space. And if we don't respond, then other worlds will see that rebellion is possible, and the whole transition collapses into chaos." The paradox was elegant and terrifying. The Imperium had created a civilization that could only be governed through the threat of military force, but maintaining that threat required the very war economy we were trying to abandon. We were trapped in a cycle where the tools of governance were destroying the possibility of the peace we had fought to achieve. A priority Vox transmission interrupted our discussion. Admiral Valdez's voice, transmitted from the Eternal Vigilance in high orbit, carried an edge of barely controlled panic. "Palace Command, we have a situation developing in the outer system. 3 Astartes battle barges have entered the Sol system without proper clearance. They're requesting immediate audience with the Primarch. Unauthorized Space Marine vessels in the Sol system. Under normal circumstances, such an incident would trigger immediate military response and the highest levels of security alert. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the battle barges weren't flying enemy colors." "Identification?" Corvin asked into the Vox pickup. "Iron Hands chapter, Steel Ravens chapter, and..." Valdez's voice carried a note of disbelief. "The survivors of the Lamenters chapter, all requesting emergency counsel with Lord Commander Guilliman regarding preservation of Astartes' heritage." The Lamenters. I knew their history. A chapter cursed with perpetual bad luck, always arriving too late to save the innocents they were sworn to protect, always suffering disproportionate casualties in every engagement. They had been reduced to less than 200 battle brothers after their final campaign, but their gene seed was still pure, their loyalty beyond question. If even the Lamenters were questioning the transition, Our crisis was deeper than anyone had imagined. Within the hour, I found myself in an emergency session of the High Lords, watching as some of the galaxy's most legendary space marines made their case for continued military operations. Captain Cardan Stronos of the Iron Hands stood before Lord Commander Guilliman with the rigid precision of a warrior who had never known anything but war. "My Lord Primarch," he said, his voice carrying the metallic edge of extensive augmetic modification, "we have come to request clarification of our orders. The transition protocols call for the disbandment of 12 Space Marine chapters, including our own. We seek to understand the logic of destroying weapons that required 10,000 years to forge." Guilliman's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the strain in his superhuman features. "The logic, Captain Stronos, is efficiency. The Imperium cannot sustain a war economy when there is no war to fight. Your chapters have served with honor beyond measure, but honor does not justify unlimited resource expenditure." "With respect, my lord," interjected Captain Malakim Foros of the Lamenters, "we were not created to be efficient. We were created to be necessary. If efficiency was the goal, our father would have built factories, not space marines." The statement carried a weight of truth that was difficult to argue against. Space marines were not efficient in any conventional sense. They required massive resource investment, extensive training periods, and constant maintenance of equipment and facilities. From a purely economic perspective, they were indeed obsolete in a pacified galaxy, but they were also the living embodiment of the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. To disband them was to abandon the dream that had launched the Great Crusade in the first place. Captain Stronos activated a portable holographic projector, displaying strategic maps of several sectors. "Furthermore, my lord, our intelligence networks indicate that the pacification may not be as complete as Imperial records suggest." The hologram zoomed in on a cluster of systems near the galactic rim, highlighting anomalous readings that had been dismissed as navigational errors in the official reports. "These energy signatures are consistent with previously unknown xeno civilizations," Stronos continued. "The explorator fleets have been recalled before completing their surveys of the Outer Rim territories. We may have achieved victory in the known galaxy while leaving entire regions unexplored and potentially hostile." Lord Commander Guilliman studied the display with the intensity of a military commander who had spent his existence evaluating threats and opportunities. "These readings could represent natural phenomena, Captain. Stellar anomalies, gravitational distortions, any number of non-hostile explanations." "Could, my lord. But certainty requires investigation. Investigation requires military assets. Military assets require space marines." The argument was compelling, offering a potential justification for maintaining at least some level of military readiness. But I could see in Guilliman's expression that he understood the deeper issue. If they searched hard enough, if they looked far enough, they would always find something that could be construed as a threat. The galaxy was vast beyond comprehension, full of mysteries and anomalies that could justify eternal vigilance. The question was whether such justification would save the Imperium or simply perpetuate the cycle of warfare that was consuming our civilization's resources. Captain Foros of the Lamenters spoke again, his voice carrying the weariness of a warrior who had seen too much loss. "My lord, my chapter has always arrived too late to save those we were sworn to protect. We have borne that curse for millennia, accepting it as the price of our service. But now we arrive too late to save ourselves. The Lamenters are being dissolved not because we failed, but because we succeeded too well. Is this justice?" The question hung in the chamber like incense in a cathedral, carrying implications that went far beyond simple military reorganization. Were we punishing our greatest heroes for their very success? Were we destroying the tools of our victory because we could no longer justify their cost? "The decision has been made," Guilliman said finally, but his voice lacked the absolute authority I had always associated with the Primarch. "The Imperium must adapt to peace, even if that adaptation requires sacrifice from those who made peace possible." Captain Stronos's augmetic eye blazed with what might have been anger. "Then we request permission to maintain our chapters independently, without Imperial resource support. We will find our own purposes, forge our own destinies, continue the traditions that have sustained us for 10 millennia. And when those purposes conflict with imperial policy, when your independent operations threaten the peace we have achieved, then you will have the same choice our ancestors faced during the Horus heresy, Stronos replied. Loyalty or efficiency, honor or pragmatism, the soul of humanity or the mere survival of human flesh. The chamber fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the assembled High Lords like a burial shroud. We had defeated the enemies of humanity, only to discover that our greatest enemy might be ourselves. Lord Commander Guilliman rose from his throne, his massive form commanding the attention of every person in the chamber. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of history and the uncertainty of an unknowable future. You have served the Imperium with honor beyond measure, he said. You have earned the right to choose your own fate. But choose wisely, my brothers. The galaxy you would preserve may not be worth preserving if it can only exist through endless war. The Space Marines departed without another word, their silence more ominous than any threat they might have voiced. As their footsteps faded in the corridor beyond, I realized that we had just witnessed something unprecedented in Imperial history. The moment when the Emperor's chosen warriors began to question the wisdom of the Emperor's vision. Outside the chamber's windows, Terra's golden spires still caught the light of Sol, still proclaimed humanity's destiny to rule the stars. But the shadows they cast seemed longer now, darker, filled with the uncertainty of a species that had forgotten how to exist without enemies to destroy. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth again, and I understood finally what it truly meant. We weren't breathing the air of conquered worlds. We were breathing the dying breath of everything we had once been. Everything we had sacrificed to achieve this moment of ultimate victory, and we were slowly suffocating on our own success. Chapter 8. What Remains? 6 months after the Great Transition began, I found myself standing in the same observation deck where this story started, watching the golden light of terror fade behind us as the Eternal Vigilance departed for what Admiral Valdez had carefully termed deep space exploration missions. The reality was simpler and more complex. We were running away. The Imperium had fractured, not catastrophically, not in the spectacular fashion of the Horus heresy or the Age of Apostasy, but quietly, inexorably, like a glacier slowly breaking apart under its own weight. 37 worlds had declared independence from Imperial authority. 12 Space Marine chapters had simply vanished, taking their battle barges and equipment to unknown destinations. The astropathic choir was reporting increasingly erratic communication patterns as the psychic turbulence of war was replaced by the strange calm of peace. Lord Commander Guilliman had officially declared the Great Transition a success, but his words carried the hollow ring of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Yes, civilian infrastructure projects were showing remarkable progress. Yes, agricultural yields were increasing dramatically. Yes, scientific research was advancing at unprecedented rates. But none of that mattered if the civilization implementing these improvements was slowly dissolving into component parts. Captain General Corvin joined me at the observation deck viewport, his expression carrying the same mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty that had become common among Imperial military officers. He had accepted his reassignment to military historical research, but the irony wasn't lost on either of us. He was now documenting the end of the very institution that had given his life meaning. "Where are we going?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Officially, Segmentum Ultima, to investigate the anomalous readings that Captain Stronos identified. Unofficially." He gestured toward the star field ahead of us. "As far from terror as we can get, while still maintaining plausible justification." The mission parameters were deliberately vague, allowing for maximum flexibility in our operations. We were to survey unexplored systems, investigate potential threats, establish contact with any unknown human colonies we might discover. It was the kind of assignment that could justify years of independent operation, exactly what Admiral Valdez needed to keep her fleet intact during the chaos of demobilization. And the crew? How are they adapting? Corvin's laugh was bitter. "About as well as you'd expect. The guard units are relieved to have a mission again, even if it's just exploration. The Space Marines are... Well, Lieutenant Cassius asked me yesterday if we were likely to find anything worth fighting. When I told him probably not, he said that was fine. At least we'd be doing something other than sitting in dock waiting to be disbanded. I thought about Lieutenant Cassius and his fellow Ultramarines, warriors whose entire existence had been shaped by the demands of eternal conflict. The exploration mission offered them purpose, even if that purpose was largely illusory. We all knew that the chances of finding significant threats in the unexplored systems were minimal. The galaxy had been surveyed and conquered with ruthless efficiency, but illusion was better than despair. What about the civilian populations we're leaving behind? I asked. That's the truly frightening part, Corvin replied. Some of them are adapting better than the military is. Worlds that never knew anything but war are discovering what peace actually feels like, and they're embracing it. Agricultural communities are developing art and literature and music that has nothing to do with martial glory. Research facilities are making breakthroughs that have peaceful applications. That sounds positive. It would be if it weren't for the other half. The worlds that can't adapt, that are fragmenting into tribal warfare or demanding the return of military governance. The populations that are choosing civil conflict over civilian administration. We've created a civilization that only knows how to exist in a state of crisis, and removing the crisis doesn't create peace, it creates chaos. A priority Vox transmission interrupted our conversation, Admiral Valdez's voice filling the observation deck with carefully controlled tension. All senior staff to the Strategium, Priority Alpha. We exchanged glances. Priority Alpha still meant potential enemy contact, even in this strange new age. Perhaps Captain Stronos had been right about the unexplored systems containing threats. The Strategium was buzzing with activity when we arrived, but the energy felt different from the old days. There was excitement, yes, but it carried an edge of desperation. The enthusiasm of soldiers who had been given something to do after months of purposeless waiting. Admiral Valdez stood before the main holographic display, which showed a sector map of our destination region. Several systems were highlighted in amber, indicating anomalous readings that required investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded fleets through the darkest days of the Crusade. "We have detected what appear to be artificial energy signatures in the Kronos sector. Long-range augurs suggest possible xenoform activity in 3 separate systems. The silence that followed was profound. Xenoform activity, aliens, enemies, the thing we had all hoped to find but never dared to expect. Tech Adept Axiom 7. Gamma's mechadendrites writhed with what I recognized as excitement. Query: certainty level of xenoform identification? 63% probability based on energy pattern analysis, Valdez replied. Could be natural phenomena, abandoned human technology, or, she paused significantly, genuine non-human intelligence. Captain Commander Licia of the Adepta Sororitas leaned forward in her chair, and I could see the change in her posture as dormant instincts awakened. Orders, Admiral. Full investigation. We proceed to the Kronos sector and conduct detailed surveys of all anomalous systems. If we do encounter xenoform activity, we assess the threat level and respond accordingly. Lieutenant Cassius spoke for the first time in weeks, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope. And if they prove hostile, Admiral, Valdez's smile was grim but genuine. Then we remember what we were made for. The transformation in the ship's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Crew members who had been going through the motions of duty with mechanical precision suddenly moved with renewed purpose. Training schedules were revised, weapon systems were checked and rechecked. Tactical planning sessions resumed with an intensity that had been absent since the end of the Final Crusade. We had spent 6 months learning to live without war, but in less than 6 hours, the mere possibility of conflict had restored something we had thought was lost forever: the sense that we mattered. Over the following days, as the eternal vigilance made its way through the warp toward the Kronos sector, I found myself documenting the change in our crew's behavior. It was as if someone had awakened sleepers who had been dreaming of better times. Guard officers revised tactical doctrines that hadn't been updated in months. Space Marines resumed combat drills with an enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. Even the tech adepts seemed more animated as they prepared for the possibility of encountering unknown technology. But beneath the renewed energy, I detected something troubling. The realization that we needed enemies to function properly. Without external threats to unite against, the Imperium was fragmenting. With even the possibility of new enemies, we regained our cohesion and sense of purpose. What did that say about us as a species? What did it mean that humanity's greatest civilization could only maintain unity through eternal conflict? The answer came when we finally reached the Kronos sector and began our detailed surveys. The anomalous energy signatures were real, but they weren't alien in origin. They were human. The remnants of a dark age of technology colony ship that had been drifting through space for over 20,000 years. Its automated systems still functioning, but its human cargo long dead. The disappointment was palpable. Even the discovery of advanced technological artifacts couldn't compensate for the fact that we hadn't found new enemies to fight. The brief moment of renewed purpose dissolved back into the familiar emptiness that had plagued us since the Final Crusade's end. But something unexpected emerged from our investigation of the derelict colony ship. Hidden within its databanks, we found records of the human civilization that had existed before the Age of Strife, before the Emperor's unification of Terra, before the dream of galactic conquest had consumed our species. Those ancient humans had achieved something we had forgotten was possible. They had built a peaceful, prosperous, scientifically advanced civilization that lasted for thousands of years without requiring external enemies to maintain unity. They had explored the galaxy not to conquer it, but to understand it. They had developed technology not to wage war, but to improve life. They had reached for the stars not because they feared what was in the darkness, but because they were curious about the light. They had been destroyed by the chaos of old night, by the psychic storms that made interstellar travel impossible, by the civil wars and alien invasions that marked the end of their golden age. But for a brief moment in human history, they had proven that our species was capable of something more than endless conflict. As I compiled my report on the discovery, I found myself thinking about the choice that faced the Imperium. We could continue to seek enemies, to justify our military culture through the discovery or creation of new threats. We could maintain the war economy by finding new wars to fight, new worlds to conquer, new species to exterminate. Or we could try to become something our ancestors had been, something we had forgotten in 10,000 years of warfare. A civilization that defined itself by what it built rather than what it destroyed. The choice wasn't mine to make. It belonged to Lord Commander Guilliman and the High Lords, to the billions of Imperial citizens who would have to learn new ways of living, to the Space Marines and Guard regiments and Sisters of Battle who would have to find new purposes in a galaxy without enemies. But as I stood on the observation deck, watching the stars wheel past in their eternal patterns, I realized that the choice had already been made for us by the simple fact of our victory. We had conquered the galaxy, whether we were ready for the consequences or not. Now we had to live with what we had won. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth one final time, and I finally understood what it truly meant. It wasn't the air of conquered worlds, or dying enemies, or suffocating success. It was the air of possibility, the breath of a species that had the chance to become something greater than the sum of its wars. Whether we would take that chance remained to be seen. But for the first time since the silence fell, I began to hope that we might. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to human ambitions and fears. They had watched our rise from primitive barbarians to galactic conquerors, had witnessed our struggles with demons and aliens, and the darkness of our own souls. Now they would watch to see what we became when the fighting finally stopped. In the end, that might be the most important battle we ever fought. The war to discover who we were when we weren't at war. And unlike every other conflict in human history, it was a battle we could only win by choosing not to fight. Personal log entry 47.1, 6 months after Kronos sector discovery. The irony of my situation is not lost on me. I, who have spent 3 centuries chronicling the greatest military campaigns in human history, now find myself documenting the most profound peacetime crisis our species has ever faced. The stylus feels heavy in my hand as I write these words, weighted not with the gravity of epic battles or heroic sacrifices, but with the quiet desperation of a civilization learning to live with itself. Captain General Corvin found me in my quarters this morning, staring at blank parchment that should have been filled with daily observations. He has aged visibly in these past months, not from the toll of combat, but from something far more insidious. The slow erosion of purpose that comes when everything you were trained for becomes obsolete overnight. "Still can't find the words?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my writing desk with the careful movements of a man whose augmetic joints were never designed for prolonged periods of inactivity. "I can find them," I replied, gesturing to the scattered data slates that covered my workspace like grave markers. "I just don't know if anyone will want to read them." The reports from across the galaxy continued to arrive daily, each one adding another layer to the complex tapestry of humanity's struggle with its own success. Some worlds were thriving in ways that would have been unimaginable during the war years. Agri-worlds that had spent millennia producing nothing but military rations were now developing sophisticated culinary traditions. Forge worlds were redirecting their manufacturing capabilities towards civilian technologies that enhanced quality of life rather than efficiency of destruction. But for every success story, there were 3 tales of communities that had simply stopped. Populations that had existed for so long in a state of crisis that they couldn't function without external threats to unite against. Military installations that had become ghost towns overnight as their purposes evaporated. Recruitment worlds that were experiencing mass emigration as young people sought opportunities that didn't exist in cultures built around the production of warriors. "There's something else," Corvin said, producing a data slate that bore the seal of Lord Commander Gilliman himself. "New orders from Terra were being recalled." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I read the transmission. The exploration missions were being terminated. All remaining Imperial fleets were to return to their home sectors for what the official language called Final Integration Protocols. The subtext was clear enough. The experiment was over. The attempt to maintain some semblance of the old military structure had failed. "What about the crews?" I asked. "Individual choice," Corvin replied. "They can accept civilian resettlement packages, request assignment to planetary defense forces, or..." He paused, his bionic eye focusing on something beyond my viewport. "Or they can choose the alternative." The alternative. We both knew what that meant, even though the official documents wrapped it in euphemistic language. Veterans who couldn't adapt to civilian life, who couldn't find purpose in a galaxy without enemies, could request what the administratum called honored rest, voluntary termination, administered with all the dignity and respect that the Imperium could muster. The numbers were staggering. In the 6 months since the Great Transition began, over 40,000 Imperial Guard veterans had chosen honored rest rather than face life without war. Space Marines were requesting stasis suspension in numbers that threatened the very existence of their chapters. Even some members of the Adepta Sororitas were choosing martyrdom over the prospect of a peaceful existence. "And you?" I asked. "What will you choose?" Corvin was quiet for several minutes, his gaze fixed on the tactical displays that no longer showed enemy positions, but rather shipping lanes and trade routes and civilian infrastructure projects. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of exhaustion that 3 centuries of warfare had never been able to produce. "I've been thinking about that conversation we had on Terra," he said. "About what happens to warriors when the war is over. I think I finally understand the answer. Which is, we become something else or we become nothing at all." The simplicity of his statement was profound. The choice facing every veteran of the Great Crusade wasn't whether to continue serving, That option no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The choice was whether to reinvent themselves as something they had never been, or to simply cease existing, rather than live as pale shadows of their former selves. I thought about Lieutenant Cassius, who had accepted assignment to a planetary defense force on a world so peaceful that his greatest challenge would be mediating disputes between agricultural collectives. The young space marine, who had once asked what purpose a weapon served without something to destroy, was learning to become something other than a weapon. Whether he would succeed remained to be seen. "There's something else in those reports," Corvin continued, activating another section of his data slate. "Something that's not being widely circulated, but which I think you need to know as the chronicler of this period." The document that appeared was classified at the highest levels, bearing seals from the Inquisition itself. As I read, I felt the familiar chill that came with encountering knowledge that was perhaps too dangerous to possess. The report detailed the discovery of what Inquisitor Vex called purpose cults, communities of former military personnel who had created their own conflicts to justify their continued existence. Guard veterans who had established mock wars against each other, complete with carefully choreographed battles and acceptable casualty rates. Space Marine squads that had begun hunting imaginary enemies in the depths of hive cities, convincing themselves that they were uncovering hidden threats that required their intervention. Most disturbing were the reports of entire worlds that had begun manufacturing their own enemies. Populations that couldn't adapt to peace were creating artificial conflicts, territorial disputes, religious schisms, resource competitions, anything that would restore the familiar rhythm of crisis and response that had defined their existence for generations. "They're inventing reasons to fight," I said, unable to keep the horror out of my voice. "Because fighting is all they know how to do," Corvin replied. "Take away the external enemies, and some people will create internal ones rather than face the alternative." The implications were staggering. If significant portions of Imperial civilization couldn't adapt to peace, then peace itself became a threat to Imperial unity. The very success of the Great Crusade was generating the conditions for civil conflict on a scale that could dwarf even the Horus heresy. What's Lord Commander Guilliman's response? Officially, careful monitoring and gradual intervention where necessary. Unofficially, Corvin's expression grew grim. "I think he's beginning to understand that we may have achieved something unprecedented in human history. A victory so complete that it threatens to destroy the civilization that won it." The Voxcaster chimed with an incoming transmission from Admiral Valdez. Her voice carried the formal tone she used for ship-wide announcements, but underneath, I could hear the same exhaustion that had become endemic among Imperial officers. "All hands, this is Admiral Valdez. We have received our final orders from Terra. The exploration mission is concluded. We will be translating to the Sol system within the next 48 hours for final fleet disposition. I want to thank each of you for your service during this transitional period." Transitional period. The euphemism couldn't disguise the reality of what we had experienced. This hadn't been a transition. It had been a slow-motion collapse, disguised as administrative reorganization. After Corvin left, I found myself walking through sections of the Eternal Vigilance that I had rarely visited during our active service years. The ship felt different now, not just because of reduced crew complement, but because the energy that had once sustained us was simply gone. In the training decks, equipment sat unused, not because there weren't enough personnel to operate it, but because there was no point in training for battles that would never come. In the chapel, I discovered Sister Superior Cordelia conducting evening prayers before a congregation that had dwindled to fewer than a dozen souls. Her words carried the same fervor they always had, but the responses from her small congregation were mechanical, lacking the passionate conviction that had once characterized Imperial faith. "Sister Superior," I said after the service had concluded and the other worshippers had departed, "how are your sisters adapting to our new circumstances?" Cordelia's expression was carefully composed, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She was a veteran of 17 campaigns, a warrior who had faced demon princes and alien warlords with unshakable faith. Now she seemed diminished somehow, as if the absence of enemies to fight had leached some essential vitality from her spirit. "We serve the Emperor's will," she replied, the standard response to almost any question in Imperial military culture. "If his will is that we should learn to live in peace, then we shall learn. And if some find that learning difficult, then they must trust that the Emperor has a purpose for them that they cannot yet see." Her voice carried conviction, but it was the forced conviction of someone trying to persuade herself as much as her audience. The God Emperor has guided humanity through 10,000 years of warfare. Perhaps he is now guiding us into something greater. Or perhaps, I said quietly, we've finally achieved something that even he didn't anticipate. The words were borderline heretical, but Cordelia didn't rebuke me. Instead, she was quiet for several moments, her gaze fixed on the small shrine that dominated the chapel's altar, a simple aquila flanked by representations of the Emperor's greatest victories. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted finally, "about whether this was always his plan, or whether we've somehow exceeded his expectations. The theological implications are troubling." "How so?" "If this peace is part of his design, then the suffering of the past 10 millennia was necessary to achieve it. All the death, all the sacrifice, all the horror, it was the price of creating a galaxy safe for human prosperity." She paused, her expression growing more troubled. "But if it wasn't part of his plan, if we've achieved something that even the master of mankind didn't foresee, then we're on our own," I finished. The possibility hung in the air between us like incense in a cathedral, carrying implications that neither of us was prepared to fully examine. The Imperium's entire social structure was built around the assumption that the Emperor was guiding humanity towards some predetermined destiny. If that assumption was false, if we had somehow achieved a victory that exceeded even divine expectations, then every certainty that had sustained Imperial civilization for 10 millennia was suddenly open to question. Later that evening, I found myself in the ship's archives, attempting to compile what I knew would be my final official report as a military chronicler. The words came slowly, each sentence weighted with the knowledge that I was documenting not just the end of a campaign, but the end of an entire way of life. Personal observations on the conclusion of the Great Crusade and the implementation of Imperial peace protocols. Subject: comprehensive assessment of military to civilian transition. Effectiveness classification: Vermilion. The document that emerged was unlike anything I had written in 3 centuries of service. Instead of tactical assessments and casualty reports, I found myself analyzing the psychological costs of victory, the social implications of peace, and the existential crisis facing a species that had forgotten how to live without enemies. The statistics were sobering. Military suicide rates had increased by 400% since the transition began. Planetary rebellions were occurring at a rate not seen since the age of apostasy. Resource allocation models suggested that the Imperium could support perhaps 30% of its current population at pre-war living standards. The rest would need to accept dramatic reductions in quality of life or face potential starvation. But hidden within the grim data were signs of something unprecedented in human history: the emergence of a genuinely peaceful civilization. Worlds that had successfully transitioned from military to civilian governance were reporting improvements in every measurable quality of life indicator. Scientific advancement was accelerating exponentially. Artistic and cultural achievement was flourishing in communities that had never had time for such luxuries during the war years. Humanity was simultaneously facing its greatest crisis and achieving its greatest triumph. We were discovering that we could be something more than warriors, but only if we could survive the process of transformation. As I completed my final report, I realized that the question I had started with, what happens after the Final Crusade, didn't have a simple answer. What happened was choice, the fundamental choice between growth and decay, between adaptation and stagnation, between becoming something greater than we had been and clinging to the familiar certainty of eternal conflict. Some would choose adaptation, would learn to find purpose in exploration rather than conquest, in creation rather than destruction, in the vast possibilities of peace rather than the narrow certainties of war. Others would choose the alternative, would prefer the honor of death to the uncertainty of change, would seek the familiar comfort of conflict, even if that conflict had to be manufactured from nothing. And still others, perhaps the majority, would simply endure, caught between what they had been and what they might become, neither fully adapting nor completely rejecting the new reality, but somehow managing to survive in the strange twilight between war and peace. The choice wasn't just individual, it was civilizational. The Imperium itself would have to decide what it wanted to become now that it had achieved everything it had originally set out to accomplish. That decision would determine whether humanity's greatest victory became its greatest triumph or its final tragedy. As the Eternal Vigilance prepared for its final translation to the Sol system, I stood once again on the observation deck where this chronicle began, watching the stars wheel past in their eternal dance. Tomorrow, we would reach Terra and face whatever judgment the High Lords had prepared for us. Tomorrow, the great experiment of Imperial peace would enter its next phase. But tonight, suspended between past and future, between war and peace, between certainty and possibility, I allowed myself to hope that we might choose wisely, that we might prove ourselves worthy of the victory we had won, that we might finally learn to live with the peace we had fought so hard to achieve. The taste of reclaimed air filled my mouth one last time, and I finally understood its true meaning. It wasn't the air of conquered worlds or defeated enemies or uncertain futures. It was simply the air of choice itself, the breath of a species that had earned the right to determine its own destiny. Whether we would prove wise enough to make the right choices remained to be seen, but for the first time in 10,000 years, the choice was ours to make. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was finally peace. And perhaps, just perhaps, we might be strong enough to deserve it. Chronicler's Final Addendum. These records are sealed by order of the High Lords of Terra. They are to be preserved in the palace archives as a testament to the price of victory and a warning to future generations who may face similar choices. The Great Crusade is ended. The age of war is concluded. What comes next is up to us. May the Emperor guide us to make the right choice. Chronicler-Prime Matthias Valen. Final entry, Personal Chronicles, date 847, M42. Location, en route to Terra.